A very good morning to all of you. As the storm rages on, let us just preserve our collective sanities and start discussing the questions and the issues in Gray's elegy. Now, I would like to discuss four important issues here. The first is this question about the elegy, the form of the elegy, and whether Gay's Gray's elegy can be considered to be a pastoral elegy or not, a question that came up in our last discussion. I'll then move on to discussing the pre-romantic qualities of Gray's poem, asking how it forms within the intermediate zone between two literary, as it were, moments. In the third section, I will discuss the question of the ideology of Gray's elegy. I would say, is it a poem which sort of supports, or how does it sort of address the question of transition? How does it respond to power structures, and so on and so forth? And finally, in the last part of the discussion, I will talk about memory and remembrance, and in a circular way, come back to the form of the elegy itself as the memorial of this remembrance. So let me begin by addressing this question about pastoral elegy, which some of you have put forth in your discussions. Now, Gray's elegy is not strictly a pastoral elegy in that sense of the term. Why do I say so? Because the elegy, if you remember, was originally a poem which was written in a particular meter, generally dactylic hexameter or pentameter using the heroic strain, and was generally a poem of reflection in the classical age. Now, it took on a pastoral shape through the poems of Theocritus and later on even Horace. But the elegy as a poem of mourning, it came up in its specific connotation in approximately the beginnings of the 17th century. And significantly, we will have a lot of poems during this period, including Spenser's The Shepherd's Calendar, which uses the pastoral form in a large way. We, of course, have the pastoral elegy in Milton earlier. We will also have it in Shelley and later on Matthew Arnold. But Gray's elegy is not specifically directed towards any pastoral creation of the rural countryside. You see, there is a certain structure within the pastoral elegy itself. The pastoral elegy sort of idealizes the figure of the shepherd and an idyllic pastoral background. It begins with an expression of grief, invocation to the muse, and describes a funeral procession. And while mourning through nature, it also has reflections upon death. Now, there are some features with Gray borrows. For example, this reflection upon death he borrows. The rural background he borrows. But you need to focus on the fact that in Gray, the idyllic pastoral background is never created. That is to say, the background of the poem evokes nature, but this nature is a nature of also hardship. So what Gray does is, instead of the shepherd, he posits the farmer at the center, the farmer and the ordinary villager at the center of the elegy, and the poem actually describes the hardships and the daily activities of this particular class of people. So instead of the shepherd, what Gray takes is a collective of the rural people with their various professions, and he describes the obscurity of their life. So he foregrounds them, no doubt, but the idyllic aspect of the elegy, the pastoral quality of the elegy, and also the kind of formal structures of the elegy, including the invocation to the muse, the funeral procession, the description of a shepherd life, is completely absent in Gray. There is only one funeral procession, if you remember at the end of the poem, the funeral procession of the poet. Therefore, what Gray is mourning is not one individual, right? Because generally in the pastoral elegy, the person who is mourned is given the features of a shepherd and mourned. Now, Gray collectively mourns for two things. One is the obscurity of the life of the villager who is then, absorbed in death. And second, he mourns the transience of human life. There's a third mourning also of the poet, rustic poet, who sort of fades into oblivion. But the general tone of mourning is about the alternative history of the common man whose life and death takes place outside the focus of history. Now, Gray is, of course, using part of the conventions of the elegy in making this poem a reflection on death itself. But here also lies an interesting parallel. Gray does not, and this is something which you should remember, Gray does not foreground death with all its grisly, with all its immediate effect, as in the graveyard poets. The graveyard poets create an elaborate background, atmosphere, and present death in all its finality and solidity. While Gray uses the image of the tomb, while Gray uses the image of darkness, there is always a certain periphrasis, a certain circumlocution, easing out the impact of death. There is reflection on death, but death is not presented in all its harshness. Rather, death is seen as an equalizer who makes the rich and the poor equal at the end. So we can probably claim that Gray is problematizing both the conventions of the pastoral elegy as well as the conventions of the graveyard poems. Now, we can, of course, argue that this poem was originally written at the death of Richard West. But this is very interesting in the way in which Gray does not make the poem a mourning for one individual. There's, of course, the figure of the poet, but even the poet is seen as the collective of this vast mass of rural people who compose the bulk of the nation, yet are never written into the histories of the nation. So rather than, you see, a sense of deep mourning, there's a sense of unease, there's a sense of regret that these people have not found their just ways into the history of the nation. So at the end of the day, what is this elegy all about? Now, it's very interesting that this elegy is also distinctly English. Therefore, there's a strong nationalist element within the elegy. The topography that is described is very definitively English. And the three protagonists whom Gray describes, Hampden, Milton, and Cromwell, are also English, right? Therefore, there's a strong sense of the English countryside which is built into the poem proper. But what does the elegy symbolize then? The elegy symbolizes a mourning for a particular historically erased segment of the rural population. It talks about how histories are dominantly urban, how histories are dominantly based on heroic military activities, and how the common activities of everyday life, which forms the cycle or the bulk of the cycle of national life, is erased from history altogether. So Gray is, as it were, recharging or revitalizing the elegy. Is taking it back to the classical norm, where the elegy is a poem of reflection. And this reflection is not merely about the death of any particular individual, it is about the death of the collective rural people within the annals of history. So there's a depth which is added to the elegy as well. Now, the other elegic aspect that Gray is bringing in is, of course, this transition from a rural society to an urban society, which I shall, of course, discuss in my in the next segment of this presentation. Now, the third category which Gray talks about in the elegy is the poet and his epitaph. Now, you remember that the original elegy was just 88 lines, and that it was a more general reflection about death and how death makes everybody equal. But Gray significantly changed the elegy to a great extent, and he added this incident of the rural poet who is lost within nature, who is segregated even from his society, who is found dead, and who is brought back to the churchyard and buried, and on whose epitaph, is written that he sort of sought only one friend, and he lost himself amongst nature and returns to God. Now, that last line, of course, gives a Christian dimension to the elegy and mourns the passing of this obscure poet. Now, Gray is, of course, here also talking about the subjective poet with his isolated status from society, one who articulates the aspirations of his particular people, but who remains obscure and beyond literature that is circulated. So the poem is also about the obscure poets who are part and parcel of the kingdom of poets, as it were. Right? So even literary history and the figures who are left out of literary history become part and parcel of the mourning of the elegy. Finally, I'm going to argue that the elegy is about the form of the elegy itself. And especially these four stanzas which I talked about, and if you look at my earlier lectures, you'll find that Dr. Johnson talks about these four stanzas, where Gray makes the point that even the meanest, even the most insignificant of human beings search for an epitaph, search for a way in which he must be remembered. So at the end of the poem, if you take these four stanzas, then the elegy is about also this human truth that death will come, and the human desire that beyond death there will be remembrance. So Gray, as it were, mournfully, with melancholia, he acknowledges death, but he moves beyond death and sees the elegy as the form through which remembrance and memory can work and move across time. So the elegy becomes the vehicle, as it were, as I keep on saying, the vehicle through which the dead can talk to the living, and therefore, articulates this concept of memory and remembrance. So what have I suggested? I've suggested that Gray's elegy, while it takes the form of the classical elegy, it problematizes and departs from that tradition to a large extent. It does not conform to the classical structure of the elegy, with the shepherd at the center, the mourners, the funeral procession, the idyllic description of the land, and the final resolution with the complaint and acceptance of death. It rather foregrounds the collective country people at the center, does not romanticize their life. It acknowledges the hardships and the difficulties of their existence, and it also highlights how they are erased from the pages of history. So I've argued that Gray uses a classical meter, but he problematizes the elegy to talk about larger and more profound themes of the erasure of a particular segment of the population from history, an erasure of the country poet from literary history. He talks about how and where, how death equalizes everybody at the end. And finally, he talks about how the elegy itself becomes the vehicle of remembrance and memory. So it is in this way that we can see that Gray's elegy is a far deeply problematic negotiation with the form of the classical elegy. Right. Okay, so that is one part of the discussion, the first part. Now let me move on to the second part, and this question about the pre-romantic, or the question about Gray's elegy as existing in that twilight zone between two literary moments, the Augustan and the Romantic. Now, you will obviously have looked at my first lecture on Gray, where I had posited him as this transitional poet who exists within the corpus of the literature of sensibility. At the center of the literature of sensibility is a heightened sensitivity towards the common people, a heightened melancholic reflection on life, and finally, the identification with the figure of the poet and the rural poet and his relationship with nature that will deepen in Wordsworth's idea of the poet later on. Now, what are the Augustan elements that Gray brings? Gray's use of the form of the elegy with its classical counterparts, and we have in our annotations looked at how Gray uses Theocritus, he uses Horace, he uses Dante right at the beginning of the text, he uses Addison, for example, he uses his contemporary poets like Blair and Young. So this entire intertextual reference to the centrality of death and the inevitability of death is taken from already a collective body of classical and contemporary poetry. And Gray borrows the heroic meter, the iambic pentameter, and the quatrain with alternating rhyme schemes. So in terms of form and in terms of this reflection on death, Gray's elegy is definitely part of an Augustan tradition. Now, when Gray talks about the boast of heraldry and the pomp of power and the paths of glory leading to the grave, he is falling back upon certain classical Augustan stereotypes, which were used copiously by Lucretius, which was used copiously by Horace, Dante, and his contemporary poets in his reflection on the inevitability of death. So in terms of the basic content of the poem is fundamentally Augustan in its technique. But, and I would also suggest that in certain stanzas, of course, there are very deliberately Christian elements. For example, in the last stanza, when the poet meets his creator God, there is a certain Christian and classical confluence in the way in which the elegy closes. And that makes it more inclined towards the Augustan rather than towards the Romantic. But there are certain very important strains here to be noted. First and foremost, the tone of the poem is not as objective as Augustan poetry. There's a certain subjective influx or influence within the elegy, so that it makes the reflection of death far more subjective than general as in Augustan poetry. The second point is, and here we will suggest that this great sensitivity and this sentimentality that Gray demonstrates towards the country people, towards the lone poet, towards the people who are laid in the country churchyard, as it were, suggests this influx of sensibility. Now, the literature of sensibility, as of course you might have noted from my first discussion, always focused on the marginalized. So it was the poor, it was the disabled, and in this case, it is the impoverished people of the English countryside who become the heroes of Gray's elegy. Unfortunately, however, Gray cannot name them, and he cannot access their lives because they are written out of history. And therefore, this great sensibility towards a group of people, towards a vast mass of people, not a group really, that manifests itself very powerfully in the elegy proper. And it is in this sensibility, I think, that the poem approximates the movement towards Romanticism 1. Now, the second aspect, of course, is this sense of mourning, the tone which does not merely talk about death, but also the passing of a way of life, of the rural way of life that Gray mourns. Located in the subtext of the poem is, of course, the footsteps of a more aggressive commercial capitalist modernity, which is somewhere on the fringes of the poem, which never really enters into the poem proper. But Gray's mourning, like Goldsmith before him or Young, is about this passing of this pastoral, of this feudal, agrarian way of life to a more mechanized, commercial, modern way of life in the city. So in this transition from the country to the city, although Gray does not make it a direct subject, but in this mourning for the rural way of life, Gray's poem is anticipating many of the dominant themes of Romanticism. You will remember how Wordsworth and Keats both will be talking about the city in greatly difficult terms and will seek refuge within nature. The third, of course, is this natural, or rather, let us call it the common man who becomes the subject matter of lyrical ballads. And Wordsworth's poetry is, as Wordsworth claims, about the common citizen, the rural individual, and his natural landscape. So in the evocation of the landscape, in the centralization of the rural man, the poem approximates the romantic concerns in a significant number of ways. How about language? Because Wordsworth talks about the poem or about poetry as, and the poet is a man speaking to man. So the usage of a less formal and more spontaneous way of language. Now, Gray's elegy at times uses the classical cliches and uses a stylized way of language. But if you look carefully within the poem, it does not fall into the trap of the overt generalizations and cliches of graveyard poems. Rather, the subjective approach, the use of common words, the use of a very easy rhyme scheme, it suggests that Gray is trying to experiment with the language of poetry and making it more accessible to the common man. You remember that episode at the end where, Gray is asking the swain, old swain, to read the epitaph. And he says, you will not be able to read it because you do not know the language. So, in that sense, there is an attempt on Gray's part to simplify language and make it accessible, more accessible to the common citizen. So, that also is in certain ways a kind of a adumbration, a kind of an anticipation of the Romantic movement. Finally, of course, and this is where the distinct Romantic concerns of the elegy can be located, is in the way in which the mourning actually sort of transfers itself, and the poem itself transfers from the general mourning for the people to the specific figure of the poet. Now, remember, almost all Romantic poems do this. If you look at Shelley, for example, if you look at Wordsworth, for example, what happens in these poems is always that the poem begins with a certain subject and comes back to the subjective figure of the poet. And in Gray's elegy too, it could have been a very good graveyard poem with generalizations on death. But Gray suddenly departs at the end of the poem to talk about this rural poet lost within nature. Now, this inclusion of the poet as the one who preserves this record of the transition and the alternative history of the people in his poetry is one aspect of Romantic poetry. The other aspect of Romantic poetry is the isolated poet who is within the very lap of nature itself. So the one communion with nature, the poet who mutters to himself, the poet who talks to nature, who's seen in the lap of the tree, who is seen by the babbling brook. And you see how, there is a certain pattern or a certain communion between the poet with nature, which Gray talks about. And this bond between the poet, the sensitive poet, and nature is one which, of course, Wordsworth will later on anticipate, or Wordsworth will later on experiment with in the both in Tinted Abbey as well as in the Excursion and as well as in the Prelude. But I would like to make one critical distinction here, in that within Gray's poetry, while there is this existence of the rural poet with his communion with nature, we do not have, like Wordsworth, any specific insight that the poet has, any specific epiphanies that the poet has. The poet seems, in Gray, largely impotent in that sense of the term, in being able to communicate any great message about the still, sad music of humanity that Wordsworth talks about, any great insight into the imaginative process of poetry whatsoever. Right. So while there is a movement towards the foregrounding of the poet and his communion with nature, ultimately the poem is not romantic in the sense that it can access any greater epiphany or any greater sort of source of sustenance or any pantheist delight that nature provides, or any great philosophical truth that that we can access through Keats's odes, or any revolutionary impact that we can offer through Shelley's poetry. It is a rather placid acceptance of death that is the message of the text. And therefore, the poem exists within that liminal zone between the formal structures of Augustan poetry and the communication about death, and the more radical aspects of Romantic poetry in its foregrounding of the transition from the rural to the urban, in its foregrounding of the figure of sensibility, in its foregrounding of the figure of the poet, and its foregrounding of the individual's relationship with nature. Of course, you see, while Gray will talk about memory as well, and memory becomes a very important subject of Romantic poetry, Gray will not talk about any great, you know, accessibility through memory in that sense of the term. Gray will only talk about the desire of the human to be remembered. But, there is no ulterior importance of memory in the creative process as in the Romantic Wordsworth. Right? So, to say that Gray, has many romantic features would be probably wrong. Gray stands on that crossroad between Augustinism and Romanticism and looks behind to some of the features, the formal features mainly, and to some of the thematic concerns of the Romantics. The Romantics will take these thematic concerns and infuse a new subjectivity and a new epiphanic consciousness, a significant radical reconstruction of subjectivity and memory later on. So that is where we can place Gray in that twilight zone between Augustinism and Romanticism. And if you want to use the word pre-Romantic, you can do so, but I would prefer Gray as an example of the transitional poet. Now, these two were largely more or less obvious concerns, which I'm sure most of you would have noticed by now. I'm just articulating them in my own way. But let me come to two more difficult concerns of the elegy. And these are really issues that we need to engage with. What is the ideological position of Gray? Right, that is my first question. What does the elegy tell us? Now, if you sift out the remembrance, the memory, then the elegy is about the state of the common people. Right. So, does it argue about any great radical reconstitution of class positions within society? Now, the first to comment on this issue was, of course, William Emerson. Now, Emerson suggests that the entire premise of Gray's elegy is hypocritical, that Gray argues in the text that one should simply accept status inequalities as they are, and there is no attempt made whatsoever by the people described in Gray's elegy to overturn these consequences, and they merely accept their fate as it is. Right. Therefore, Emerson suggests that Gray's statements of sympathy, and I'm quoting him, are statements of apathy. The poor should be content with the sympathy they receive in poetry and should ask for nothing more. So, Emerson suggests that Gray is using the elegy to frame the poor in a discourse of sympathy and acceptance from which they really have no escape. So they live in obscurity and they will die in obscurity. And this is the cyclical process that is going to go on. So Gray's elegy, he sees, is largely a conservative poem which maintains the status quo. Now, incidentally, Gray also talks about empire and how these people might have been agents of empire, but they were never really given the access. Now, in that sense also, politically also, Gray's poetry seems to conform to the colonial stereotype and therefore offer no great radical experimentation. Now, the problem with this interpretation, of course, is the fact that Gray mentions three people within the elegy. And these three people who are mentioned are Hampden, Cromwell, and Milton. All three were in their own ways radicals because they challenged the monarchical world order of the day. You will remember that Hampden refused to pay the shipping tax and was a great friend of Cromwell, who visited him often. And Cromwell was, of course, this great figure of parliamentarism, who later on, of course, moved on to tyranny. Now, Milton was, of course, a radical in his demand for the freedom of the press, and also, if you look at Paradise Lost, challenges the status quo in terms of political ideology. These figures, does he talk about, and also the common people, does he talk about what we call a challenge? There's this theory that Gray uses the form of the elegy, and you will have to ponder over the fact, why does he do so? What does an elegy do? And if you look at it very carefully, then Gray's elegy highlights the inevitability of death, be it the pomp of power or whatever. Ultimately, the end, as Gray suggests, is in death. So is Gray poetically suggesting that death is the great leveler, that people who are obscure outside the world of the church and in the world of the churchyard? So the church and the churchyard are, as it were, two different classes within Gray's society. The church being reserved for the aristocracy, and the churchyard being the zone where the obscure graves of the unknown people are located. So in death and in poetry, in Gray's elegy, therefore, does Gray's elegy become the space for this democratic leveler, where death levels the aristocratic, the vain, the glorious, the majestic, and the common people? Now, this interpretation, of course, is supported by the fact that Gray's poetry talks about the potential of the rural people to equally shine as the heroes did. That there is a sense of regret and waste, that the vast talents of the rural people were never really utilized because they lacked the opportunity. So in that sense, Gray is talking about, or Gray is bringing to the fact that there is a whole mass of humanity who is denied the privilege, and therefore denied the privilege in history. In that sense, Gray is actually talking about two histories. One, the history of the urban, the history of the courtly aristocratic world, which dominates the national history, versus the rural agricultural history, which sustains the nation, but which is erased from the pages of history whatsoever. Therefore, in that sense, interpreters have also suggested that Gray's elegy is radical in that it persuades, or it pleads for the recognition of that history. And in that history, the presence of these three figures suggests a more democratic leveling, and this is done through death and the presence of the elegy. So this articulation is made by John Gilroy and Suvir Kaul, for example. Gilroy talks about Gray as using a vernacular poetic language. So the simplification of language is seen as this essential part of radical democratization of poetry, and suggests that the poem's use of pathos signals an attempt to channel difficult questions of rank, status, city, and country into the morally correct emotion, and that the complexities of modernity find their resolution under the legitimizing aegis of history. Right. So Gilroy also adds that the poem actively reflects upon class structure and does not merely reflect it. So What Emerson suggested, it just reflects the class structure and perpetuates it. Gilroy suggests that the poem reflects upon class structure, reflects the class structure, but also reflects, philosophizes upon it, and therefore critically evaluates how the poor are written out of both national history and literary history, right? And that is why both Call and Gilroy suggest that the figure of the poet is included, the figure of the poet who can then talk about the desire of the common people to be remembered, and through the elegy, through the vehicle of the elegy, to put forward their point of view. So, seen in this stance, the choice of the elegy, the choice of the language, is a deliberate strategy by Gray to bring into sharper focus the lost voices of history. And in that sense, Gray's elegy is not apathetic, but more radical. Now, Cole also makes another point when he says that the churchyard is that liminal space between the country and the city. Outside the churchyard, or beyond the boundary of the churchyard, lies the country, lies the city, lies aggressive, and the city is symbolic of aggressive modernization and commercialization. Whereas the church and the churchyard symbolize the pre-modern agrarian setup. So the poem, in validating the churchyard and validating the mass of common people who are not yet part of this commercialization and aggressive modernization, is seeking, as it were, to resist this rampant transformation of society. And it is in this that Gray's elegy also becomes a kind of a poem of protest. But whatever this protest might be, there is a certain tone of acceptance within Gray's elegy. Therefore, the radical content of the elegy is not very pronounced. It is rather a kind of a dirge and a lament, and an acceptance of the fact, probably, that the older order is changing into the new, and that this process of transformation is a process which, however regretful, must be, is inevitable, just like death. So you see, at the end of the day, don't just read the elegy as just about a poem of death. It is equally about a poem of so many elements, and there are layers and multiple nuances that go into the making of the elegy. Now, having talked about the paradoxes of the ideology, so you can read the poem, if you want, with Emerson as something which is merely reactionary in the sense that it accepts the status quo, or you might read it with Gilroy and Subir Kaul as a poem which contains a few radical questionings of the status quo. So that is where and you can also see this as a poem which challenges and which laments the passing of one form of civilization to another. So in that sense, the elegy becomes the vehicle, the mourning becomes the vehicle through which a new subjectivity is given to this passing. So, having discussed the elegy, let me come to the last part of my discussion. And this discussion is about memory, remembrance, and the form of the elegy. Now, I had, when I began the essay, talked about the elegy as essentially a poem of mourning, and therefore, after a period of mourning, the acceptance of the fact of death and the movement into life. Now, while Gray uses these standard forms of graveyard poetry, and this is the school within which Gray is writing, remember, that there is the creation of the atmosphere of melancholy. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the sounds, the sights, the synesthesia of the sense of passing, the twilight atmosphere, and that acceptance of the fact of the death. and the reflection on the inevitability of death that will ultimately bring the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural alike. Gray's elegy does not end in the way the Graveyard School of Poetry does. The Graveyard School of Poetry ends with the macabre finality of death, and that death is all permanent. What the poem rather ends with is, and this is what Dr. Johnson had pointed out, is the desire of the human, however mean, however minuscule, insignificant he may be, of creating some form of memory and remembrance, especially in the description of the headstones over the unnamed graves. Now, it's very interesting. The graves are unnamed, but the headstones contain some erroneous inscription or the other, be it from the Bible or be it some more common verses. Now, Gray suggests that ultimately death is the leveler, and that whatever storied urn or animated bust or common headstone, the fact of death remains supreme. But he suggests that while death remains supreme, also equally valid is the human desire for life. So nobody wants to leave the hearth and go into the land of the dead voluntarily. And all human beings, as Gray points out, small or grand, want some form of memory. And this appeal towards remembrance, this appeal towards memory, this teetering onto life, even in death, makes the elegy immensely problematic. Now, you see, the pastoral elegy, while it mourns the passing of the individual and fixes him in memory, will later on access the inevitability of death and move on from mourning to a celebration of life. Gray's elegy seems to be rooted in the fact that across time the dead want to be remembered by a passerby, and therefore the country churchyard, as it were, the churchyard itself remains not as a final resting place, but also as a place where the dead want to communicate with the living through the process of memory. Right, so this fixation of memory, this perennial attempt to communicate, draws me to the Freudian essay of mourning and melancholia. Now, deep within Gray's poetry lies a melancholia about death. It does not accept, while, let me not put it in this way, while it accepts death, it does not accept complete loss of the human, as it were. And therefore, memory becomes the moment, or memory becomes the vehicle through which the selfhood of the dead, or the self of the dead, might be accessed in some form or the other. So the dead do not vanish, do not go away. They linger, or they attempt to linger in the memory. And that is where you see that memorial of the poet becomes very important. Although the elegy seems to end with this Christian reconciliation, that the poet is finally meeting his God and his maker. But this attempt of that epitaph, the attempt of those uneducated people trying to create a headstone for themselves so that they linger in the memory, draws the elegy towards a far deeper human psychology of the importance of memory and remembrance, and poetry as a vehicle through which the remembrance might occur. Now, I am tempted at the end of this discussion, I'm at the end of this discussion almost, that the elegy ultimately is about the elegy. What do I mean by this? The elegy is not merely about just the mourning for the country people's erasure, not the mourning about the transition of one kind of society to the other. The elegy is ultimately about the human desire for remembrance and the poetic capacity, and the capacity of poetry rather, to preserve that memory in some form, especially in that of the elegy. So the end of the poem, you see, when the young poet, the rural poet is, laid to rest, and that epitaph remains there, the elegy preserves that epitaph and therefore preserves the memory of the people, of that poet. And it is through the epitaph and through the elegy that the dead mean to communicate with us. Therefore, the elegy then becomes a kind of a validation of the elegy and raises the issues of memory, remembrance, and death, and forms a complex dialectic in which these themes can be discussed. Right. So that is what I had to comment about the elegy proper. We have, as you have already found out, discussed four major issues. One is the form of the pastoral elegy, which Gray problematizes. The second is the transitional mode which the poem seeks to capture and stands between the Augustan and the Romantic. The third is the ideology of the poem, whether it is radical in its ideology or whether it acquiesces to the status quo. And finally, we've talked about how memory, remembrance, and the form of the elegy become central to Gray's poetry. With that, I would like to bring my discussion on Gray's elegy to a close. We've had four discussions. The first, introducing Gray and the literature of sensibility. The next two, discussing thoroughly the annotations of the poem. And finally, the one which folded up with the discussion on the themes and issues that the elegy raises. I hope this journey through the elegy has been as fulfilling as it has been for me. And I thank you for your patience and your presence. I will look forward to you on my channel in my subsequent discussions as well. Thank you. Have a good day.